Hello and welcome to The Herd Has Spoken, a podcast brought to you by GoMuskOx Men's Apparel. Welcome to episode 22 of The Herd Has Spoken. I really think you're going to enjoy today's guest, Chris Rizik. Chris is a venture capitalist. He's an attorney. He's an accountant. And most importantly to Chris, he is a founder. He launched a company called SoulTracks many years ago, which is now the preeminent place online for anything having to do with soul music. Chris is the founder of Renaissance Venture Capital. It's been around since 2008. Chris has a ton of experience in terms of investing, and we get into a lot of his advice and his approach to investing as part of the show. So really excited to share. A member of the GoMuskOx herd who's a big fan of all of our products, the Dean of Venture Capital in the state of Michigan, Chris Rizik. Chris Rizik, welcome to The Herd Has Spoken.
Thanks so much, Brett. It's awesome being here.
Well, listen, like you've had a lot of success across a lot of fields, accounting, law, venture capital. But what I want to start with today is to hear a little bit more about something that I know is a passion project of yours, and that's SoulTracks. Can you share a little bit about what SoulTracks is and how you got started with it?
So it really began when I was a student at Michigan State, and I had this itch to write about music. So I went to the editor of the State News, which then was the largest student newspaper in the country, and asked if they had anybody who reviewed soul music. That was kind of the music that I'd grown up with here in Michigan, of course, and I just felt like I could do an okay job of it. And sort of they looked at me like, go for it, guy. Nobody's ever thought about doing that. So I became a staff writer and started writing about it and really loved what I was doing and loved writing about it. Briefly thought about it as a career, but I wasn't that good. So I stuck with accounting, right? And then finished, graduated, and didn't think of it again until the internet came in like 2000, 2001. And as a fan of soul music, I would go online and there was just an absence of good material, biographies, reviews, etc. And so I found a website, wrote a couple pieces just for fun and submitted it to a website. And they posted it. And then out of the blue, I got an email from XM Radio, and they had a soul music station. And the guy who ran the station said, "Wow, I really like your writing. Would you like to do a show on XM?" Basically by doing biographies of classic soul artists. And I was like, oh man, I'm so busy. And my wife, who'd lived with me and the soul music thing for years, said, "You've got to do this." So Colette got me to do it. And I went, I did a couple shows, and it wasn't really what I wanted to do. What I really loved to do was write. So literally Memorial Day weekend, 2003, I bought a program on eBay for $50 and figured out how to build a website and just started writing on airplanes or on weekends. And one thing led to another. And next thing I know, I looked on Google and I was getting a few thousand people a month, which shocked me, that were reading these mostly biographies that I was writing. And I'm a little competitive, right? And I had been involved in venture capital in a company called Launch, which was basically Pandora before Pandora. So I learned some lessons from that and just decided, okay, I'm going to actually try and turn this into something. So I had the site professionally developed. I started hiring writers, and we started doing, actively doing reviews and introducing new artists. One of the issues was soul music was kind of a dead music from radio standpoint. Radio was already on hip hop in particular and pop. And it's like, what if we create like this parallel universe where fans of soul music who can't hear what they want on the radio can learn about it, can keep up with it, and importantly, can discover that it's not a dead music. There's all kinds of new artists, and we can introduce them to new artists through SoulTracks. So that was kind of the mission, was really kind of connecting people who would love this music with artists who were doing this, but didn't have a way to reach them.
So,
And so here we are, 17, 18 years later, and it's kind of gone through the roof. We have readers in 140 countries. We have 8 writers, an editor, and it's how I spend my Saturdays and Sundays.
so did you have any plans that were specific enough to get you to where you were today when you restarted Soul Tracks?
It's been constantly just flowing. So when we first started Soul Tracks, the biography piece was huge. That's where everybody wanted. And then all of a sudden, Wikipedia came and my traffic went down by 70% in like a month. And so then it was like, okay, let's look more at reviews. And then, people stopped buying albums, became more singles oriented. So then we started doing more, introducing people to new singles and songs that they wouldn't otherwise know. That's kind of where we're at right now. We're sort of half that and half kind of getting tribute to artists that people may have forgotten that are still around. So I couldn't have planned for where we are right now.
So you just knew that you were passionate about this. You'd had some success writing for the state news while you were in college, and you said, "Wow, this internet thing's pretty cool, and I can't find what I need, and I'm not terrible at writing about soul music. Why don't we just go ahead and put this out there?" And fast forward, and you are sort of the authority online for all things soul music.
Yeah, it just kind of worked out in a way I couldn't have imagined back then.
I love it. I love it. And so obviously, like you mentioned, you spend your weekdays doing other things today. And I'm curious, what have you taken away from your work in Soul Tracks that's enabled you to be such a successful venture capitalist?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is Soul Tracks, it is a startup, or at least it was a startup, and it's still very startup-like. In the end, what I had to discover, and what every startup has to discover, is you can have an idea of what you want to do, but there's got to be a market that says this is something we want. So, Soul Tracks, I was doing these biographies, and all of a sudden the market said, we don't really want these anymore. So we had to pivot and then pivot and then pivot. Last year was by far the biggest year ever. But if I look at what Soul Tracks looked like last year, it is nothing like what it was 16 years ago. And that was a lesson that has helped me in venture capital, just kind of having lived it and realizing the need to not get so inside your head that you're no longer in tune with the market and what the market needs. I tell founders all the time, most of whom are tech founders, it's like, your technology not working is the second worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is it works and nobody cares, because that's super frustrating.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I'd love to hear your take a little bit in terms of how you most identify. So this is probably going to be a question that's tough to answer, but do you most identify as a founder, as a venture capitalist, as an accountant, or an attorney?
I would say as a founder. And in part, I'm cheating a little bit because, when I created Renaissance, I was a founder.
Absolutely.
And, like other founders, I left my other job. I went out on a limb. I had a period of, several months where the question was, is this going to happen or is this not going to happen? And, we created something different with Renaissance that nobody had done before. So it wasn't just a venture capital fund. And we've had to continue to invent all the way through the run with Renaissance. So I feel like a founder because the path that we're taking is different than anybody had taken before.
Well, I'd love to get into that with Renaissance, but before we do, I want to kind of walk through your career a little bit and understand some of those inflection points that you had. So you mentioned your time at Michigan State, and you went on to get an MBA from the University of Michigan as well. And you worked for an accountant. You worked for the C of PricewaterhouseCoopers, right? Coopers and Lybrand before it became PwC. And then you or excuse me, I don't think you got your MBA. It was law
No,
school, correct?
yeah,
I'm sorry
that's right.
about that. So then you went on to become an attorney, and you worked for Dickinson Wright for 13 years. I mean, that's a tremendous accomplishment. Extremely well respected, law firm, doing great things. Clearly on a great trajectory. And then seemingly you make this crazy transition where you move from the stable, you know, trodden path of becoming a partner at a law firm to getting involved in nanotechnology in investments. And what walk us through that moment in time when you were transitioning out of the what I would consider to be a safe space in the law firm, and walking into some crazy new technology world, which is not was not nearly as well established as it
Yeah,
is today.
yeah. I love my time at the law firm, and I became a partner, and I ran a group in the firm. And I was surrounded by just these fantastic, super smart people. For me, I guess the best way I can put it is I still push the snooze button 2 or 3 times every morning because, I liked my job, but I wasn't passionate about it. So I had thought, that I would probably end up doing something else eventually. I actually thought about doing something in music, but I didn't know what that would be. And then, literally out of the blue, I got a call from an old friend of mine who I had worked with at Cooper's, Rick Snyder, and he was starting a venture fund, and he had just moved back to Michigan from running Gateway, the old computer company. So I'm really dating myself with this, but and he was looking for a law firm to represent him. So I got the call, and we're going to meet the next morning, and I had no idea what venture capital was. So literally that night, I got out some books and figured I got to learn just enough to bluff my way through this. And so I did. Firm was hired, and then I started helping to do deals, to do venture capital deals. And it was such an interesting area. It got to the point where while I was in Dickinson Wright's Bloomfield Hills office in Michigan, I was working out in Ann Arbor because the vibe out there was so great. And one thing led to another, and a year later, he asked me if I wanted to quit Dickinson and be his partner. And I made him wait a month because I wanted to make sure I wasn't making a rash, decision. I knew the moment he asked that that's what I wanted to do because it was just really exciting. I could see the impact that we could have. I mean, the idea of starting new businesses, creating jobs, really developing the next generation of potential Michigan powerhouse companies, changing the world and all that. I didn't feel that in what I'd been doing before. So, but obviously I was leaving something very secure. I mean, I could have been at Dickinson the rest of my career and been fine with it. But I will say from the moment I left, getting back to what I said earlier, I haven't even used the alarm for the last 20 years, much less push snooze, because every day I can't wait to get up. Some days it's fear, but it's exciting every day. And that was the life-changing event of going to what was essentially a startup from the other career. And I've just been really blessed that there have been some twists and turns, but it all worked out.
Yeah, you probably have some holes in your sheets from kicking them off every morning, where your feet are poking through, because you're definitely doing some groundbreaking stuff. I'd love to maybe pause for a second and just talk about venture capital as a whole. So I think venture capital is something that a lot of people have a lot of opinions about. But it's probably harder to have as informative opinion as you do, as someone that's been involved in founding multiple venture capital funds and now funding others, which again we'll get into in a minute. But there's a lot of press in terms of the pros and the cons of venture capital. So maybe we can start with the positives. I mean, you touch on a couple of the themes, but what are things that really make venture capital a very positive instrument in terms of financing new businesses and making an impact on society as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it is super risky capital. And so there are businesses that could never take place without venture capital. I mean, case in point, and I'm involved in this one, Moderna, right? I mean, this vaccine came out as the result of venture capitalists who believed in what appeared to be this crazy idea of harnessing messenger RNA and turning it into vaccines. You know, no bank was going to finance that,
Right.
right? And it literally took over $1 billion of investor capital. Those kind of things wouldn't happen. Really, you can look at almost any major company, including we're using Zoom, right? Zoom wouldn't exist without venture capital. So when somebody has an idea that's going to take, as they most do now in technology, millions of dollars to get to feasibility, millions more to get to sustainability, the only place to get that is venture capital. So venture capital has driven the growth in our economy for the past almost 50 years. Whereas if it didn't exist, so many of these companies wouldn't have existed. So many of these technologies and innovations wouldn't have happened. And you can look around the world, and in many cases, places that have grown at a more stagnant, haven't grown at the same rate, is because they didn't have that kind of risk capital.
And it's not really hyperbole to say that the world would be very different at this very moment if it weren't for your involvement in venture capital too. When you think about Moderna, and I know you're a humble guy, and there was certainly other partners involved in that, but to be able to have capital that was investing in something that changed our ability to move forward as a society in such a positive way as being able to have a vaccine for COVID. I mean, that's a pretty compelling case that would be tough for anyone to ignore right now. And frankly, it's got to be extremely satisfying to look in the mirror at night and know that you played a role. And certainly you're not the only person, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of heavy work at Moderna that deserve a ton of credit. But to again, like they wouldn't exist if it weren't for the capital that was infused into the business at very early, very risky moments. And I have to imagine that that's a pretty satisfying thing for you.
Yes, and it's one of many satisfying things. Again, I consider my involvement so tertiary, to the brilliant people who started it and ran it and supported it all along. But there's so many stories like that, including many, here in Michigan. Take a company like LlamaSoft in Ann Arbor, at a time in COVID when supply chains were broken and the ability to manufacture, whether it's vaccines, whether it's cars, whether it's toilet paper, you have this company in Ann Arbor that was created about 12, 13 years ago that helped companies figure out, okay, if this plant here is running into trouble, here's an alternate way that we can get our supply chain going because people need Lysol wipes or toilet paper or whatever. And there's all kinds of things like that that are super satisfying. And just the idea that I can take the work that, that I've done, but also that a lot of other people in venture capital have done in Michigan, and literally trace thousands of jobs. Average pay for jobs in venture capital backed companies is almost $80,000. So high paying jobs that aren't going overseas, that wouldn't have existed here if venture capitalists wouldn't have done it. And obviously we wouldn't have the results of those companies either.
Right. A lot of things on the positive side of the scale. What about the other side? Where do you think are some of the drawbacks of venture capital? And I guess that could be answered in a lot of different ways or from different perspectives. But I guess as someone who has an angle of attorney, accountant, founder, and and VC, I'll let you pick where you think it's appropriate to answer that from.
Yeah, I would say sometimes some of the problems with venture capital. First, sometimes it can be sort of an echo chamber, and so in some ways, what's deemed important by venture capitalists may be because of the echo chamber they live in. So, I mean, I don't know that it's really important that I can tell on my phone that I'm the mayor of Starbucks or something like that. Yeah, that's not changing the world. I guess there's a need, or kind of a need, for stuff like that. But so there is an issue because venture capital tends to be concentrated in a few locales, that there is the risk that the people involved in venture capital can become fairly myopic and they appeal to their own herd, right? As opposed to looking at the world in general. So there are certainly markets that have not been served well by venture capital. And what I mean is there are populations that have been ignored by or largely ignored by venture capital backed companies. And there are people who've not been able to sort of share in venture capital, either as venture capitalists themselves or the ability to attract venture capital into their own startups. So there's been, there's so many studies that show, historically, you had 90% of venture capital going to white males. A couple of years ago, Juul, the e-cigarette company, raised more money from venture capitalists than all female founders in the whole country.
Wow.
So there's been that issue. It's certainly changing, but it by no means is it there yet.
Right. And I'm trying to do my best to not just dive into the fact that you just mentioned herd, and you were talking about a startup also named after a llama, or excuse me, after an animal, in LlamaSoft. So my muskox tenants are really going up, and I appreciate that the nomenclature you're choosing to use here. But on a more serious note, because I think this is a really important and very serious topic, I think you've continued to really innovate in the venture capital world. So you mentioned that you founded Renaissance in 2008. So now 13 years ago, and it's a fund of fun. So I'd love for you to explain to our listeners, like, what is a fund of fund means, and what does Renaissance Venture Capital do? Because obviously what you're doing is pretty unique and making a huge impact on Michigan and certainly more broadly than that as well.
Yeah, so a fund of funds, very simply, it is a fund that doesn't invest in startups. It invests in venture capital funds. So you can almost think of it's almost like a mutual fund of venture capital. We're investing in funds all over the country, and fund of funds have been around forever. The difference that we did with Renaissance was we looked at it through more than one lens. A fund of funds is a financial vehicle. You invest in venture funds, you get returns, but we turned it into a sort of a three-pronged vehicle. Certainly we want financial returns, because if you don't get financial returns, you kind of go away.
Right. It's like a football coach. You got to win games,
yes,
right?
Exactly. But we had two other areas of focus. One was, can we take this underserved area for venture capital, Michigan, and can we use Renaissance as a means of attracting capital from all over the country into Michigan? So that was the second pillar. The third pillar was, we have all these major companies around here that, beginning 2008, realized they needed to look elsewhere to get some of their innovation. They couldn't do it all internally, and that was a change for them. And so our thought was, if we are investing in venture funds around the country, they're investing in all these startups, could we use as a Renaissance as a means of taking these major companies that are looking for innovation, connecting them with innovative startups, and you create this win-win situation. A major company gets innovation they wouldn't otherwise have, that they need, and a startup company that is starved for customers can get a really important big customer, dramatically increasing the likelihood that that startup will survive. And interestingly, those three pillars I talked about, returns, the Michigan piece, and the connecting major companies to startups, those all fit together. We'd go find a venture fund on the coast and say, we'd like to invest in you, but you've got to come look at Michigan startups. And by the way, we have 70 major corporations that are willing to become customers of companies you invest in. That became very enticing, and we were able to invest in, these funds don't have problems raising money, but they were willing to engage with us and come and look in Michigan, because we created this really interesting way for them to connect with customers. And we also agreed we would help them find startup opportunities in Michigan. And we do a lot of programming around that, working with universities, and other startup organizations to make sure they get exposed to venture capital funds. So here we are 13 years later. Our goal was, if at this point we could have attracted, let's say, $800 million into Michigan, it's kind of a metric we use, we would have been ecstatic. Instead, we've attracted $2 billion into the state, and we've been sort of dollar for dollar, the amount we've invested and the amount we've brought in, the most impactful fund in the country. And it was kind of this kind of holistic view of it, connecting customers and startups and all that I think is what made it work.
So this little shop in Ann Arbor comes together with this idea, and the fund to funds idea sounds like is not new, but the notion of being able to have large corporations involved and happy to be customers and potentially acquirers suddenly gives you a competitive advantage out there, because money is money, but now you're bringing something that the other guys can't to these folks on the coasts. And you've turned that into be something that's tremendously successful. So clearly you had this idea that was extremely well thought out, right? You had the three pillars that you mentioned, but what is it that you think allowed that to be so transformationally successful? I mean, when you're talking about being one of the best returning, VCs out there, I mean, that to me has to be more than just an idea, right? I mean, what else do you think has allowed you guys to have so much success at Renaissance?
A few things. I mean, first and foremost, I have my dream team working with me, and I think just about all of them. We're not very big. We're a 5-person organization, but everybody who works at Renaissance is so committed to the organization, so committed to the vision. I mean, I can talk about this more later. What we all have a service mentality, and sometimes you don't see that in investors because they're the ones with the money. But ultimately, we have to view ourselves as service people. In the end, I don't mean to be too flip. We're all waiters at Denny's for sure, and those people who don't recognize that they are really serving customers become less successful. So that was the one thing from the beginning we had built into us, is that we're serving customers, and our customers are the major companies, our customers are the funds, our customers are the startups, and we just continue to work at making sure we remove friction from the interactions between people, and we take our egos out of it. And so I'm blessed, first of all, to have a really great team that all has bought into the vision, and they're fantastic at it. The second thing is, we happen to be in a pretty good location for this. We've got major research universities between University of Michigan, Michigan State, and Wayne State. That's $2 billion of research a year. So the fact that we had all that and we just weren't taking advantage of it before as a region, that made it kind of, if we executed properly, it should work. And then the third thing is, we had a number of major companies that were open to the idea and open to involvement, and they've been great. So it was a really good environment. We teamed with an organization called Business Leaders for Michigan when we started, and they've been a great partner. It's a nonprofit organization, the members of which are the CEOs of 80 of the largest organizations in the state. Having that connection to CEOs and having them be able to sort of buy into the vision at the highest level was extremely helpful. So it's all worked out nicely for a number of those reasons. And what we've been fortunate is that kind of the model we created here, we said this can work in other parts of the country, and it's not competitive. I mean, any place that we can help that is underserved, we're willing to help. So we took this model, we open sourced it, and we've probably taken calls from, 25 regions of the country. And 3 of them now have started it. And again, we just gave them all the information we had, all the learnings over the years. And basically created a network with them of funds like ours, each of which is focused on helping its own region, but also helping each other.
You mentioned having a fantastic team, and I love the analogy of like, hey, we're servers, right? And I think servant-based leadership is something that gets a lot of press, and rightfully so. And that clearly comes from you, right? That's something that's always been important to you. And one of the things that I've been so impressed with you in our interactions over the last 8 years or however much time it's been is that you're involved in so damn many things. I mean, you're chairing executive committees, you're involved in investment committees, left and right. They're almost too numerous to list in this podcast. If we want to keep this under an hour, Chris. But you've got so much going on. You're leading such a successful venture capital firm at Renaissance, but yet you've always been just extremely available and approachable to me and to others. And I've always sort of wondered how you do it, because it's not easy to run a company and an organization. And I'd just love to hear, like, how are you able to prioritize it and make that happen? I mean, it sounds like there's definitely a mindset of the importance of being able to be part of a community with such a fantastic mission. But is there anything else you can impart upon our listeners in terms of how you're able to make that happen?
Um, hmm. Well, that's very kind of you. I guess I would say, um, in part, it is, the idea that I have been like so fortunate, right? I mean, yeah, I guess I'm kind of smart or whatever, but the things that have happened that I couldn't have predicted have mostly been good ones. And so part of it is that. The other part is, I guess I would say, there's the old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. I think that is a bunch of BS. In really, no good deed goes unrewarded in some ways. And I can't tell you where, I took a call from a student, and didn't think I was doing anything important, talked to them for a half hour, and somehow they come back into my life 10 years later. I may not even remember that I talked to them, but they did. And, people did that for me when I was young. So when, I'm going to tell you something I've not ever said. When I was starting Renaissance and I didn't know how it was going to go, like a lot of people, I made a deal with God, right? And I said, if this can work out, I will just say yes to people, and not to spammy emails, but,
Sure.
and not to people trying to sell me stuff, but, I will simply say yes to people who need it. And there's nothing special, because people in this town, people, I'm shocked at the number of people I can call who I've never met before and say, I just need your advice for something, and they will do it. It's kind of a Midwest thing, kind of a Detroit thing. But that was kind of what I agreed to do back then.
Yeah, well, it's certainly paid off, and I think that's wonderful advice. It's funny because when I've talked with college students and talk about their networking and trying to get to know people, it's like, hey, there's three rules of networking. Number one is give first. Number two is give first, and number three is don't worry about any other rules. and I mean, you've
Exactly.
lived that, and it's clearly worked tremendously well for you, and obviously the results speak for themselves, so we don't need to dwell too much in that. If it's okay with you, I'd love to pick your brain a little bit on what makes for good investments, right? So we all know that there's a lot of capital out there. There's press now that's saying there's probably too much venture capital. It's swimming, and founders are able to get their businesses funded super quickly. But the key for any venture capitalist is where are you investing your money? So from your perspective, and now I guess I'm talking less at a fund level and more at a company level.
Mhm.
What makes for a good investment at the time you're investing those dollars?
Um, I'd say a few things. The people involved are huge. And I'll get back to that second. People, the technology or product, can this technology work? Can this product work? And then the most important thing is there a market for it, which we talked about earlier. If there's a need, you begin with the need and then you do the other things. And I guess I would say that people always think technology's first. Of those three, technology's third. The market is first. Second is the people. So I will take great people with a mediocre technology over mediocre people with a great technology, because great people will figure out a way. And if I look back, when I was investing directly in companies, I think I invested in probably 50 companies. If I looked at the ones that failed, very few failed because the technology didn't work. They usually failed because the team wasn't the right team, or most often there really wasn't interest in what they were trying to do. And it's just crushing to be working on something for years and just realize people don't care. So you see all these programs for entrepreneurs, and they tend to focus on customer discovery or figuring out the market, and they're dead on with that, because if you don't have that, you can do everything else you want and you'll never be successful. And so that is ultimately it. And if I look at the things I did, whether it's even Soul Tracks, I mean, I had to find what the market wanted. Renaissance, I had to find, what would be appealing to the stakeholders. And I think it's like that for every startup.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of commonalities across, so many different worlds that you've had a chance to live in. And one of the things that sticks out the most to me is really interesting is you're working with really large businesses. So you mentioned the business leaders of Michigan, and of course you're investing in startups. So when you think about these large corporations and these eager, big dreaming startups, do they have more in common than the average person may think, or do you think those organizations really are light years apart in terms of how they're performing and how they're thinking?
It depends. And if I look at the major companies we deal with, there are some that are extremely entrepreneurial, and they're willing to try things out. They're willing to do pilots to test things out. And then there are some that are very, very regimented. And I can't say it's based on size. It's just based on personalities. And I won't name any of the ones, neither one, but we've got several companies where, from the CEO level on down, it's like we have to continuously be improving ourselves, looking at opportunities, being aggressive. And there are others that I would say are more, I don't want to fail.
Don't rock the boat.
Yeah, I don't want to fail. Rather than I want to succeed. It's I don't want to fail. And those two bring about very different results. So the ones that are aggressive and trying to move forward, they're a lot like startups, just with more zeros and and more people they're managing. But there are other companies that are very unlike that. And I would say that latter group are companies that tend to have peaked a while ago. They're around, but they're not growing. They're kind of there.
Right. The cash cow in that sort of classic quadrant of companies.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you're talking with founders and people with big dreams, it's ultimately your objective as an investor to try to figure out who's credible and who's maybe being a little bit of a prevaricator, or someone who's full of hot air, or someone that's full of shit, depending on which your preferred approach for describing it is. But what I think of investors a lot of time is you have to have a fantastic antenna for people who are blowing smoke. And so I'd love to hear, how do you get to the bottom of that? Like what are some of the cues that you're able to read consciously because it's tough to figure things out if they're subconscious, that that give you an indication that someone is not the right fit, and then that they're it's tough to believe what it is that they're saying.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what some entrepreneurs don't understand is they feel when they pitch a VC or talk to VC, they have to pretend that they know everything, and they have to pretend like everything's all set. So, rather than say, you know what, I know these three things and we're moving down this path. I'm going to need some help at some point. I'm going to need to hire a CFO because we don't have that skill set. I'm going to need to hire a head of marketing. We're not there yet, and there's some warning flags out there we're going to have to deal with. Somebody who comes with that, I love, right? Because I realize they're being honest with themselves and with me, and we're going to have the kind of relationship that where we can help each other. The ones that come in and, sort of like, yeah, I'm all set. My nephew's the CFO. We're good there. He's got, he took an accounting class in college, and, and we're all set on sales. And I mean, most VCs have been around long enough that they can pretty quickly see what the holes are in the organization. And a CEO who comes in like that is probably now considered a hole in the organization. And so it's tough to get excited about that. The other thing that sometimes trips people up is they're so concerned about saying this all is going to happen quickly. They'll say, okay, we're talking to this potential customer, and we're pretty sure they're going to give us a purchase order in a month, and then the next one's going to happen. The next, and the obvious answer is, great, let's meet in a month after you've gotten that purchase order, and then we'll go from there. And of course, that purchase order doesn't happen, and they've kind of boxed themselves in by trying to overstate things. One thing that VCs pretty much always have is time, and the worst thing that one of the worst things that a founder can do is box themselves in by over-promising things that are time-driven, and then having a VC say, great, let's just see how that goes. If you do all those things, then now you've increased your credibility, which is, credibility being the important element of that people part I talked about. And again, it's kind of overselling doesn't work, because most VCs have kind of lived through enough and had enough things go wrong that they've got the scars on their back, and they've become a little bit more cynical.
Yeah, you learn to spot that false bravado with folks over time, and I think a firm that is based in the Midwest and humble, I think is really well suited, like particularly well suited to be able to appreciate when someone knows their limitations and knows your strengths, of course, but sort of knows what you don't know. And speaking of things that no one can truly know, would love to get your perspective on what the future of venture capital looks like. So you're someone who's continued to be an innovator in the space, continuing to grow your presence in that, which I wouldn't have thought would be possible a couple of years ago, but continues to happen for you, Chris. But where do you see venture capital heading? How is it going to look different in the future?
It's going to continue to be important because innovation isn't slowing down. And already, last year was the biggest year for venture capital ever. This year is going to dwarf last year, it looks like. So innovation is moving faster, and the need for risk capital is going to be there. I think where it's going to change is it's going to become more democratic. So it's going to be more geographically democratic, and that there will be more venture capital throughout the country. There's the old saying that talent is equally dispersed, but opportunity isn't. And I think we will see more capital coming into currently underserved regions of the area where there's talent and where there's innovation. So I think that's one change we'll see. I also think we're going to see venture capital entering into areas that it hasn't entered into before. It still needs to be a fast-growing area, but we may see more things like more material science. We're seeing things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, those types of things becoming more important. We're going to see more intersections of areas. Biotech used to be here and tech used to be here. I mean, they're going to be firmly crossing over, and that you're going to need artificial intelligence to make drugs. So we'll see a lot more of that. And I think we'll see more investors coming in. We're already seeing more corporations coming in, that are creating their own venture funds. We may even see more, almost like what we've seen, through Reddit in consumers and common folks getting involved in the stock market. I wouldn't be surprised if we ultimately saw that bleed into sort of pre-stock market things or into true venture things, something more than what we have with crowdfunding. But more of an alternative to venture capital that is has more common, regular folks in it, I think is something that we'll be likely to see. We're also going to continue to see shakeouts. So there's a lot of money being invested right now, and there's a lot of people that are going to get burned because things get a little overheated. So we'll continue to see people come in, go out. We'll continue to see companies do well, and we'll see shakeouts. It tends to be a high risk, high reward area. We've had the high reward for the last few years, but I think we're going to see the high risk part start to show itself in the not too distant future.
Well, we'll certainly be tuning in, and it's exciting to kind of think about the democratization of venture capital a little bit as you talk about being able to get it to the hands of more people. So that's something exciting to be tuned into. Well, Chris, you've been extremely generous with your time, and certainly appreciate your perspective on investing. Just a couple final questions before we let you go here. So, got to ask, what is your biggest pet peeve?
I think it would go back to something we talked about earlier. My biggest pet peeve: people who don't return emails, people who don't return calls. I'm not saying, spammy emails or that, but if you have a business relationship with someone, you just return their call. I learned that in my first job, where they actually had a rule: you had to return a call within 4 hours, and it was a great rule. And if we truly are all waiters at Denny's, you don't leave somebody sitting at their table for an hour. And again, those who don't realize that it's not just polite, it's part of the contract that we all have with each other. You talked about servant leadership. I mean, that is it. We're service oriented at work. We have to be serious service oriented at home with our spouses and our kids. That's just the way we have to live life. And those who don't recognize it, it's super frustrating for me. It's frustrating to me in the first instance because I don't like to not have something, an email or call returned, because there's a message being delivered, probably unintentionally, right? But sometimes. The second thing is that sometimes it's really nice people who don't get it, and I know that will come back to haunt them at some day, because you can't go on forever like that. Karma brings things back around.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Well said. I appreciate that and agree with that so much. Final question for you here. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I would say, and I talked earlier about how I've learned a lot from my years in venture capital, and in many ways I'd love to have my first 2 years back because I made so many mistakes. But someone told me one time that I didn't fully appreciate it until later, and they said, experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted. And I haven't learned nearly as much from things that have gone well as I have from things that didn't go well. And, hopefully I'm smarter now than I was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And if I am, it's because of things that didn't quite work out the way I wanted them to. And I kind of carried that lesson with me.
Experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted. I love
Yeah,
that. I love
yeah.
that. Well, listen, Chris, we really appreciate you joining us. We appreciate your ongoing support of Muskox and being part of the herd and really all you're doing to to go out there and change lives through these companies that are uh, it'd be hard to argue against the fact that they're making society better as a whole. So thanks for all that you do, and we appreciate your time here on the Herd Has Spoken.
Thanks so much, Brad. It was great being here, and thanks for what you're doing with this and your other work. I'm just enjoying seeing all the impact you're having.
Oh, thanks again, Chris. Thank you again to Chris for joining us on the Herd Has Spoken. We so appreciate Chris being part of the Muskox herd. I know Chris is a huge fan of all of our products and always seeking different ways to make his company better and frankly make the entire ecosystem better. And that's something that we certainly can get behind here at Muskox. And if you aren't familiar with Muskox, do yourself a favor. Go over to GoMuskOx.com and check out all the fantastic outdoor apparel we have for you to make sure you are ready for your next adventure. Again, we appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate Chris for joining us today. I am sure you learned a thing or two from Chris. He's certainly a good one. Until next time, I am Brad Hoos with The Herd Has Spoken.